So it's not just being persistent, and it's not framing. What is going on here is that it's all about feeling indebted to someone. That's the magic sauce. So because when someone comes up to you and asks you for a big favor and you decline, you feel more indebted to them than if they just ask you for a small favor. So you feel indebted, and that's why it has to be the same person asking you for the big favor and then the small favor. And after you feel indebted, then you're more willing to help them out for something small later. Hello there, Guthrie here. I'm talking about behavioral economics. Today's topic is all about how to induce compliance. And this is obviously a big question. How do we get people to take the action we want them to take? Susan wrote a book called How to Get People to Do Stuff. That's great. That uses the 7 drivers of motivation. And we're going to talk about a specific behavioral economic way that you can frame a decision to get people, to induce people into compliance. And it's all based on a paper called Reciprocal Concessions Procedure for Inducing Compliance, the Door in the Face Technique, written by Cialdini and a bunch of other people, Cialdini et al. And the whole point of the experiment was to try to get people to take an action. You would think that that's very relevant in today's world. That's what people basically pay a bajillion of dollars to all kinds of consultants, hopefully myself included, to tell them to figure it out. Well, there's a paper that explains it all right here. I'm going to tell you for free. Maybe I shouldn't, but here you go. So the request that people, and there were 3 experiments. The first experiment was basically to try and get people to go volunteer at a zoo. It was a fun little thing. It didn't take a whole lot. And so they had 2 requests. The first one was a large request, which was volunteering at a jail. And the second was a small request, which was helping out at the zoo. And so, if you just go up to someone and say, hey, you should go volunteer at the jail, no one is going to do that. In fact, in the study, no one actually agreed to volunteer at the jail. But hanging out at the zoo is a much smaller request, and they were able to get some people to do that. So they had 3 conditions, and the language here is a little complicated, but I'll try to keep it simple. The first one was called the rejection moderation condition. So after hearing the experiment make the extreme request, right, the jail, which was always rejected. Oh, I don't want to do that. The experimenter would then say, oh, no worries. Look, there's this other program at the zoo. How about you do that one? So that was the first condition. The second condition was the exposure control. So the experimenter would say, hey, we have this program and you go volunteer at a jail. And we also have this program where you volunteer at the zoo. Do you want to do one of those? So it wasn't one or the other. It was just exposing the person to the two options. The third was a small request only, in which people said, hey, do you want to go help out at the zoo? Which is, again, the small ask. So the results. When it came to asking people, hey, do you want to do the zoo? Just straight up, only 16% of people agreed to do the zoo. When they said, when the experimenter asked people, we have this jail and we have this zoo, do you want to do one of those? Only 25% of people decided to do the zoo, and no one decided to do jail. But when asking people about if they wanted to do the jail first and then being rejected, and then asking people if they wanted to volunteer at the zoo, they were able to achieve a 50% compliance rate. 50%. So they doubled the number of people who went and volunteered at the zoo just by asking about the jail first. So, I'm going to quote here from the paper, quote, starting with an extreme initial request, which is sure to be rejected, and then moving to a smaller request significantly increases the probability of a target person's agreement to the second request. Very interesting. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, and I bet you if you watch me regularly, you already have some guesses cooking in your head. So, for example, maybe you're thinking, it's framing. See, by making the first request, it makes it seem like the zoo is a much smaller request. And the researchers were curious just about that. So experiment 2 was designed to test for test for framing. There were 3 conditions again. The first condition was the rejection moderation condition. So again, subjects heard the first experimenter ask for the extreme favor, and then the second ask for the smaller one, just like in experiment 1. And that's the one that had the 50% agreement rate. So that's the big one, called the rejection moderation. Rejection, and then you give a moderated request, which is the zoo. But here's the thing: the second condition, the second condition was to have a 2 requester control. So there were now, instead of 1 experimenter, there were actually 2 people who were in on it, and so the experimenter would kind of go say hi, and then a second person would walk up and would ask the other person who was in on the gig about the jail, and the other person would respond, and then the person would, then give the ask for the zoo, and then he would turn and then ask the subject, right? So in this case, and I know I have not explained the 2 requester control, the person the target person, the person you were trying to get to do the zoo action, wasn't just exposed. They were already pre-exposed to the frame. So if the frame was big to small, right, jail to zoo, they were already exposed by someone else asking a third party. So they were there observing the situation and then got asked themselves. And then the last version was, again, the request only control, same as in experiment 1, where someone just came up and said, hey, do you want to do this zoo thing? So here's the fascinating part, and I know this is a little complicated. You should read the paper; it's better explained. But when the request moderation control was the winner with 55%, the 2 requester control, which in theory, if it was just framing, if the zoo seemed like a smaller request because you started with the jail, that should have been just as high as the rejection. But actually, only 10.5% of people, when it previously exposed to the 2 options, agreed to do the zoo. And then in the small request only control, 31% agreed to do the zoo. So that is so fascinating. So in order for the magic to work, where you ask for the jail and then you ask for the zoo, the smaller request has to be made by the same person who made the larger request. So again, in this experiment too, they had 2 different people talk, and then they would turn to you and ask, did you want to do it? It has to be, the jail request has to be made to you, and then the zoo request has to be made to you in order for the magic to work. And I quote from the paper, quote, only when the extreme and smaller favors were asked by the same requester was compliance enhanced. So it's not framing. It's not that just being exposed to the idea that I don't want, the jail sounds like a lot of work, the zoo doesn't. It's not that. And we talk about framing a lot, and it is very important. Really what's going on here is it's all about giving someone a concession. It's about a feeling of reciprocity. So before we get to the final conclusion, in just a second, the experimenters did another one, experiment 3. And this one, they just wanted to make sure it wasn't persistence. Maybe what's going on is if you just pester people, be like, hey, you should go, you should volunteer, go to the jail, go to the zoo, well, then that breaks people down. So they wanted to rule out the possibility that it was just the persistence. So experiment with 3 was set up as the same as experiment 1. The 3 controls. The first is the rejection moderation, which again was the one that works. That's where you ask for the jail, ask for the zoo, to the same person. The second control was called the equivalent request. This time, they requested to be a chaperone, which was small, and then asked to do the zoo, which is small. So instead of starting with the jail and then doing the zoo, they started with the chaperone, which is small, and then the zoo, small, small. So instead of big, small, they went small, small. Now, in theory, if it's just being persistent, then the zoo should be the same whether you went jail to small or zoo to small. Or sorry, jail to zoo, big to small, to chaperone, small, to zoo small, right? You're both asking twice. And so in theory, you should get the same response rate if it's pestering. And then the last one was, again, just a smaller request the control, hey, do you want to go to the zoo? So I know this is a little complicated, but here's the outcome. There wasn't a difference. The rejection moderation 54%, and then the small to small was only 33%, and the small request only was 33%. So it's not just being persistent, and it's not framing. What is going on here is that it's all about feeling indebted to someone. That's the magic sauce. So because when someone comes up to you and asks you for a big favor and you decline, you feel more indebted to them than if they just ask you for a small favor. So you feel indebted, and that's why it has to be the same person asking you for the big favor and then the small favor. And after you feel indebted, then you're more willing to help them out for something small later. So to sum this all up, and I hope you're able to follow, because it's a great paper, but to sum it all up, if you want to be evil and you want people to comply to your requests, follow these steps. Step 1, make a big request that you know will be turned down. Step 2, when it's turned down, make the small request that you actually want people to take. And importantly, you have to be the one to make the big request and then the small request. It has to be direct, person to person. And I quote from the paper, quote, only when the proposal of the second favor can be considered a concession on the part of the requester is compliance increased. And that's it. Those are the steps. There's 2 steps. You do it and people just do what you want. You can double your compliance rates. So try them. Let me know if it works. I should add a quick little caveat to the study. It was done a while ago, probably only with white college students. So your mileage may vary, like a lot of these things. But at least in my limited anecdotal experience, is that this sort of method really, really does work to induce compliance. But again, it's not about framing, and it's not about pestering. It's about the feeling of indebtedness. There is almost nothing that's more powerful than if I feel guilty, if I feel indebted to you. And we'll talk about some other studies before. And one other thing I should say that I've seen in other studies, just ancillarily, there seems to be a limit. So you can't keep going back to the well over and over and over with the same person and keep asking to trigger the same indebtedness. It seems like maybe the first time you ask and someone complies, that's when you have the highest response rates. But after that, you may start to see your effectiveness decrease. So keep that in mind as well. So as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you later.